Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're just going to wait another moment for a few more folks to sign on. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the TBR Webinar series. Today, Principal Analyst Chris Antlitz will be discussing enterprise adoption of private cellular networks poses opportunities and threats for telecom industry. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screens, you can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, and our survey. After the webinar, you'll receive an email with a replay link as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions for us, please submit them in the Q&A widget and on 24. You may also reach out to us after the event at webinars@tbri.com. Thanks again for joining us, and here is Chris to begin the webinar.
Great, thanks Sarah, and welcome everybody. So today we're going to be talking about private cellular networks and the impact that this is going to have in the telecom industry, the good things and maybe the not so good things for the telecom industry. So let's get started. This is me, Chris Antlitz. I'm the Principal Analyst in the telecom practice at TBR. My email address is there. If you want to reach out to me, feel free to do so. Before we jump into the material, I do just want to show everybody the coverage that the telecom practice at TBR does. So we write a variety of vendor reports. We also do benchmarks, where we benchmark companies against each other across a variety of metrics. We do market forecasting and market landscapes. The material we're going to be showing today is market landscape material. And if you look lower on the chart, there is the list of different coverage areas that we look at in the telecom domain. So we look at some of the tier 1 vendors. We have dedicated reports for them, as well as some of the leading operators. We cover the web scales, IoT. We cover the edge compute market. We cover the 5G market, the NFV SDN market, and of course, the private network opportunity is also an area that we are spearheading. We're actually launching our first private cellular networks market landscape report next month. The material we're showing in this webinar is the first pass at that report. So a lot of the material you see here will also be, will wind up in that report, some of our preliminary findings. Okay, so taxonomy, very important that we all be on the same page with what exactly we are talking about here. We are focusing specifically on cellular technologies, such as LTE, but we're mostly focusing on 5G. And the reason that is because 5G is a game changer for enterprise digitalization and driving the fourth industrial revolution. LTE, I think, was a glimpse of what was to come. 5G is the arrival of what was promised. And that is the technology we will be focusing on in the material of this webinar. We are talking about private networks that are sited on enterprise premises and utilized to provide network services for business use cases. That's what we're focusing on. So instances where an enterprise is sourcing a network for their own purposes. Now, That can manifest itself in different ways. It could be delivered as a network slice, a dedicated network slice from an operator to an enterprise. There's other models as well. We will talk about the primary models that are in the market. But from a big picture standpoint, we're looking at what enterprise companies are spending on infrastructure for 5G network environments. So our definition of enterprise includes SMBs, so that's small and medium-sized businesses, as well as large corporations, and the public sector. So that's state and local, national level government is all included in our coverage of this market. So as we said before, there's different models. So this second to last bullet point is the route to market. So the 5G solution could be provided by the enterprise, enterprise's partners, such as a CSP, a cloud service provider, or a systems integrator. Again, we're going to talk about the different models. I call it routes to market of the infrastructure. So we'll put a pin in that for now. And then last but not least here, what is included in our definition of 5G infrastructure? So we're looking at the end-to-end system, a full stack. Everything from 5G NR to 5G core to optical transport. We're looking at data center equipment for edge computing that's tied to this system. We're looking at the full breadth of product attached services, and as well as product near services. So things like installation, integration, maintenance, and managed services. So these bullet points in here tee up what we are going to be talking about from a content perspective and what we mean when we use the words enterprise, 5G, routes to market, these types of things, 5G infrastructure. Okay. So setting the stage. The fourth industrial revolution is real. This is starting to happen. We're at the very early stages of this, but we see where this is going. Basically, what's happening is this new industrial revolution is being ushered in by a variety of technologies that are at the cutting edge, 5G being one of them, but also includes artificial intelligence, machine learning, IoT, cloud, and other related technologies. Things like blockchain, for example, also I would include in that list. Leading enterprises are embracing this change as part of their digital transformations. I think most companies, I would say companies in all verticals are looking at digital transformation, and especially ones that want to be relevant as we go forward, as the economy evolves. And their business models need to evolve as well. And these technologies are going to help these companies take that evolutionary step and enter this, this digital economy. So private cellular networks is not a new thing. It's actually been around for a few decades. We've had technologies like TETRA for public safety networks, GSMR for railroad networks. We've had Private Lte, which was relatively popular over the last decade. These are the types of technologies that have primarily been utilized for mission-critical people-to-people communications. Yes, IoT as well, but for the most part, this was for mission-critical people-to-people type communications. That's changing. So 5G is now coming into this space. And how big was that market previously? So we estimate in 2019, global spend on private cellular networks infrastructure was around $5 billion. Now, the reason I want to throw that number out there is as a backward indicator is because the future of what this market size will look like is many times greater than that $5 billion number. Once we start looking at the implications across a broad range of verticals and how their businesses will be fundamentally changed as they implement these new technologies, of which 5G is one of them, this opportunity is going to scale rapidly. So I'm on the third bullet point now. When you coalesce 5G with other technologies, the AI, the ML, blockchain, etc., this promises to fundamentally transform entire industries and society. So 5G can be utilized on a standalone basis, but also, and more commonly, it's going to be integrated with other technologies like the cloud for edge computing. IoT traffic is going to run over the 5G network. Blockchain traffic will probably run over a 5G-centric network. AI and ML will not only optimize the cell environment, but will also be embedded in the applications that are running over that physical infrastructure. So these technologies kind of coalesce together and they drive each other. And they're critical aspects of this broader digital transformation. Some enterprises are getting ahead of this, and they're already looking at their 5G play. So they're figuring out strategies for these broader digital transformations, and they're weaving 5G into those strategic plans. We'll talk about some of those companies later in the presentation. In many cases, this is going to entail transforming the communications network, but it's also going to, and more importantly, impact the operations technology in the companies. So when we talk about something like smart factory and the manufacturing of the future, that is an example of using 5G to transform the operations technology where you're actually producing the product. That's net new, and that's a key foundational reason why the market size for 5G, for private 5G, is going to be much, much larger than the size of the historical private cellular networks market. CSPs will have a role to play in this market. However, our initial findings suggest that a large portion of this opportunity is at risk of going to other players in the ecosystem, such as public cloud providers like the AWSs of the world, network vendors, SIs, and disruptive startup type companies. We're going to share some examples of that as we go through the material. Okay, so phases of the market. So I want to contextualize where we were, where we are, and where I think we're going. And that's what the three columns in this chart show. So we said before that leading enterprises are already preparing for 5G and more broadly their digital transformations. However, the technology, the 5G technology is not ready yet. It's not ready for commercial deployment yet. It won't be ready until 2021 for various reasons. We'll get into those reasons later. But let's go back to the chart here. So over the last decade, this was what I call the Private Lte Era. We saw hundreds of enterprises around the world implement private 5G networks across a broad range of verticals. And they leveraged LTE for a variety of use cases. It was also IoT was one of the key use cases for this. So narrowband IoT and LTE-M became foundational for IoT used in these private LTE networks. Yes, we saw other technologies as well, like Sigfox and LoRa and other things like that. But LTE was very competitive technology and was widely deployed, again, across hundreds of networks globally. 5G isn't real yet for enterprises. It wasn't real yet up until by the end of this year. It's still not real until the end of this year. And the timing, the reason for that is it's contingent on 3GPP standards, devices, regulators, and spectrum availability. So 3GPP standards, let me talk about that real quick. Release 16 and 17 are critical are foundational for a 5G network with the features that are required that enterprises are going to leverage for their communications and their OT aspects. Things like URLLC, massive IoT, those types of things we're waiting for the standards bodies to lock and freeze those standards. That should happen by the end of this year. We'll get a first batch, and then release 17 will come later next year. Devices, we're waiting on chipsets for the devices, for the device compatibility. This is not just smartphones. This extends to enterprise-grade devices, inventory management POS systems. Could be the industrial manufacturing machines that are used in those factories. They need to be equipped, retrofitted with compatible chipsets that can utilize the 5G network. We're waiting on those devices. There's a time lag there. Earliest we're going to see those come to market is early next year. Regulators and spectrum availability. So there has been some work here, some progress. So in some countries, private spectrum has become available, or it's in process of becoming available. It's moving through the regulations. So that's positive. Also, operators have some critical spectrum bands that are going to be leveraged for private networks, especially in the mid-band. So 3.5, CBRS in the States as one example. And then regulators, we still need to see some innovation in regulatory frameworks as we move into a data-centric economy, and privacy and security, and how those things are going to be changed, how we're going to see some legislation and laws and rules around these things that enable companies and the government to implement these new technologies and leverage the full breadth that these technologies provide, as well as realize the full benefits that these technologies promise. We're in the 5G transition phase right now, so we're at the very early end of this. And in this phase, we're going to see early adopters experiment with new technologies, such as network slicing and use cases, and begin to implement commercial networks at scale. So it's really going to start in 2021. That's when this market begins, for the reasons we mentioned before. And the last bullet point there mentions that. So the stars align in 2021, which is going to be the breakout year for private 5G networks. That timeline, it could be early 2021, it could be late 2021. It really depends on how the current world situation plays out, and the timing of that could delay those stars from aligning. So for example, I wouldn't be surprised if the 3GPP standards got delayed because of what's going on in the world right now, just as an example. And then in the third phase, when we realize the benefits here, when we realize Industry 4.0, the 5G technology should be mature by then, by the middle of this decade, and it should be widely utilized across industry. So by this time, all the features, the key features that have been promised with 5G should be mature by 2025, and we should see scaled deployments of 5G, and we should see a vibrant and robust device ecosystem, as well as broad spectrum availability. By that time frame, we're going to see big scale transformation happen. It's coming. And it's going to be across many industries. If anybody has questions, please add them to the Q&A box, and we will take them one by one at the end. So, I wanted to do pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses of 5G versus LTE and Wi-Fi 6. And I have a list of strengths and weaknesses for each of these technologies. One thing I want to stress here is, once you do an assessment of the list, and yes, I'm probably missing some key things If you see anything missing from this that you want to table, we can do that in the Q&A session. So what I want to stress here is that 5G is superior across a variety of angles over LTE and Wi-Fi 6. 5G has it all, and the weaknesses are manageable. I believe that 5G will be the great converger of access mediums. 5G core ultimately will be that great converger, and that's due to the architecture that's utilized for 5G core. And the other benefits that are inherent in 5G that are just better than LTE and Wi-Fi 6, security features, latency, being able to have resiliency and high availability in the system. The performance characteristics of 5G is far superior to LTE and Wi-Fi 6. So for example, Wi-Fi 6, really good technology. It is competitive depending on what it's being used for. If you're looking for using widely available free spectrum, unlicensed spectrum, it's your best bet. If you're looking for cheap module prices, cheap chipset prices, massive best effort bandwidth, indoor-centric environments for like LAN environments, then Wi-Fi 6 might be the best option for you. For LTE, if you're looking for WAN, and you're looking to do things like wide area IoT for relatively data not intensive type use cases, and something that's broadly deployed globally, LTE might be your best bet. If you're an enterprise and you're looking to fundamentally change your operations of, say, your production environments for the manufacturing of products, you're probably not going to use LTE or Wi-Fi 6. You're probably going to use the technology that offers the best performance, the best KPIs, and the best outcomes overall, and that's going to be 5G. Some of the weaknesses of 5G is, as of now, it has relatively high access point and device costs, so the chipsets are expensive. Those prices will come down over time. System complexity. 5G architecture is very complicated, but there are some very smart people around the world working on this, especially places like 3GPP, working on standardizing that architecture and making it easier to consume and leverage. So that will get worked out over time. I think that cloud native aspects of the 5G core and the inherent virtualization of that platform is ultimately going to make it more web scale-like in how it's deployed and consumed, scaled up, scaled down, and how agile it is. Once the code that runs behind that system becomes standardized, normalized, and able to be widely scaled, I think that will address some of the system complexity. So it's going to take some time, but we will get there. We've seen this happen with other technologies where it starts out very complicated, and then over time, working with it and making it more easier to use will ultimately play out. And then delayed time to market. So any enterprise that wants to deploy 5G today, they can't do it. Or at least they can't do it in the way that they would want to do it, which is using a full stack 5G SA build. So 5G standalone build where you're using 5G NR with a full 5G core. The 5G core is not ready yet. That won't be ready until release 16 is locked and finalized. And then on the NR side, we're waiting for release 16 as well for some of the key features like URLLC and some other features that enterprises are waiting and that they're going to want to use. So there is that delayed time to market, but the weaknesses of 5G will ultimately be addressed within the next couple of years, I would say, and it's going to make it the benefits of using that technology versus some of the alternatives. The benefits are going to far outweigh the weaknesses of 5G relative to some of the other access mediums. At least that's what we believe based on our initial findings. Okay, so let's talk about some industries. So I listed 6 industries here that are among, I would say, spearheading use of private cellular networks as part of their broader digital transformations. There are instances of companies in each of these 6 verticals that are currently experimenting with 5G. These 6 verticals, I believe, will be the leaders. They will drive most of the first wave of adoption of private 5G networks. There will be others, so healthcare, especially with what's going on in the world today. There's a lot of talk about how telemedicine is going to become widely adopted as a means of handling, health emergencies like we're currently facing, as well as other benefits that telemedicine can provide. So I would say healthcare is going to be another key vertical that private 5G will be looked at. But these 6, so I listed some sub-industries under each of these broader industries to give you an idea of the breadth and the scope of what kinds of companies to expect are working on this. So we're going to talk about some of those companies coming up, but what I want to convey here is that these are, for the most part, asset-intensive industries, for the most part. For things like retail, that's an interesting one. That implicates things like advertising, things like 3D virtual clothing try-on, where you're in a remote location or you're in the store and you want to see how something looks on you, but you don't want to actually go into the fitting room and put it on. So there's a whole other array of use cases where private 5G networks could play a key role. And then there's also the public sector. So we have emergency responders, so public safety networks, and then we have military applications. There'll also be other more civilian-oriented use cases for 5G that will ultimately be utilized where you would want a private 5G network. Okay, use cases. So anywhere where you have a mission-critical, latency-sensitive use case, those are going to be your best candidates for 5G, but those are by no means going to be your only candidates for 5G. 5G is dynamic, it's flexible, it is able to adapt to whatever the use case is. It's basically good at pretty much everything when you put it up against LTE and Wi-Fi 6. Again, it comes down to things like complexity, cost points, time to market. These are some of the issues where someone might want to go with a different access medium versus 5G. But let's talk about some of these use cases. So communications, that's more of the same, status quo. So using it for public safety networks, where maybe police officers have real-time video at a very low latency, very granular, high-resolution visibility, maybe for firefighters that are going into a burning building, using real-time thermal imaging, using a private 5G network, which could be equipped and retrofitted into a fire truck, for example, where you have a mini 5G network embedded into that first responder vehicle. So that could be a use case. So things like mission-critical communications. Campus LAN is another big thing that's being talked about. So for enterprises or governments that want a private network perimeter around their campus, 5G could provide that. Asset insights is a kind of an umbrella term that manifests itself in many different ways. Predictive diagnostics, supply chain management, AR/VR, things like training, troubleshooting, military training. So in some cases, it's being used for combat training. And it's also used for things like gaming. So there's all different ways that AR/VR can, use cases that can manifest itself from using a private 5G network. Visual intelligence is another umbrella term. That includes all kinds of things. So everything from surveillance to product quality inspection, safety inspection, image recognition, and waste reduction. Some of these would be utilized in a manufacturing or logistics type environment. Some of these would be broadly applicable for surveillance, for security purposes, but it can manifest itself in many different ways. And in these situations, you'd have high resolution, you would require low latency, real time. 5G is the way to go, or fixed line. If you have fixed line, like a full fiber connection or a full Ethernet connection, then that's ideal. But in instances where you don't have that, or it's cost prohibitive to do fixed line, you'd want to use, and you needed to use wireless, you'd want to go with 5G for something like that. You'll get the best QoS. Advertising, so we talked about retail and using some of the use cases in retail. So location-aware advertisements in shopping centers is one thing where there's some innovation going on there for malls, even individual stores, brands that are looking to roll that out at their different stores. Cloud robotics automation, another umbrella term, but that includes things like remote machine control and self-driving vehicles. So autonomous transportation could be controlling a crane, a construction crane, or a shipping container crane from a remote location. It could be controlling a drone. That's all kind of under that umbrella of cloud robotics automation. And again, you need certain characteristics, certain performance thresholds that 5G is able to provide that LTE and Wi-Fi 6 just not going to cut it for what you would need to operate those types of use cases in the best way possible. Okay, so as part of our landscapes, we usually provide a list of key companies to keep an eye on, as well as the categories of stakeholders. So this list of companies is by no means exhaustive. There are many, many, many companies that could be listed here. We're cognizant of that. I listed some for talking points, and just to give you an idea of who's involved in this. So operators, AT&T, Telefonica, Verizon, many, many operators around the world are involving themselves in network slices or looking at providing local 5G networks where they provide the infrastructure and they would manage, install, potentially own and operate it on behalf of the enterprise. Cloud providers, so we see examples of IBM, Amazon, Google. These guys are all getting into the space in different ways. IT systems integrators, so these are partners usually of the enterprise, and they're usually tasked with embedding these new technologies into the enterprise environments. And you have a broad range of companies that are in that space, ranging from Accenture all the way to Tech Mahindra, as well as smaller, more niche type SIs as well. Which brings us to industrial systems integrators like Rockwell Automation and Siemens. These companies are sometimes called upon to implement industrial process automation inside of factories, and they provide not only the equipment but also the services to do the actual implementation of these environments. Now, they're key players in private 5G, and they're actively working on experimenting here and investing in R&D, et cetera. Network solution providers, so these are your traditional network OEMs that would be providing the 5G NR, the 5G core, potentially aspects of the edge compute stack, those types of things, optical transport for any haul. These are the types of players you'd see there. And then disruptors and more startup type companies. So I got Federated Wireless and Maven are listed here. There's a laundry list of companies, and we'll be providing a much broader list in the landscape. I just wanted to point out here that there's different types of companies in that category that are looking to capitalize on the opportunities here. The private 5G opportunity is going to be massive, and it's going to play out over this decade, and we're going to see many, many companies with disruptive technologies come into the market and play a key role in the ecosystem, in the value chain. Okay, so I am going to move a little faster here just so we have enough time for Q&A. Reasons why enterprises want private networks. So I've got a list of reasons why they do and do not want to work with CSPs. This is a debate that is frequently brought up in the industry. Some some of the larger enterprises do not want to work with the telcos for whatever reason. I have some of those key reasons listed there on the far left. This is about ownership control, cultural mindset, a concern the CSPs lack deep knowledge of their businesses, and the pain points that these enterprises face. They want greater customization of the solutions for their specific needs. There's a can-do attitude by some of these larger enterprises that have highly capable CIO organizations that can deal with the complexity of private 5G networks. And they're very proud. I've spoken with some of these folks, some of these CIOs in some of these enterprises. They're very proud of the in-house knowledge and competency that they have, and they are very confident that they will be able to deal with most, if not all, of the aspects of these private 5G networks. And then reasons why enterprise might procure 5G from a CSP. So there are reasons why it would make sense to go to a CSP to source a private network. Some enterprises do not have that confidence that their existing resources are going to be able to handle 5G. They might need resource augmentation. They might need capabilities that they don't have in-house currently. They might need to rely on the telco for that. Network slices. This is an opportunity for telcos to provide more cost-efficient way of consuming 5G resources, such as pay for what you use. This could be a more attractive economic model for enterprises that want to use 5G but don't want to spend the full amount that it would cost to have a full system that they own, control, and operate themselves. CSPs can provide spectrum and SLAs, and CSPs can also cost-effectively provide wide area network coverage, such as global roaming. For something like logistics, as an example, this might be an instance where a logistics company would go to the CSP because it's more cost-effective for them to do it this way, rather than try and do it all themselves like some of the manufacturers are planning to do. These lists are not exhaustive, by the way. There are other things. These are some of the things that we see keep coming up. So we listed those out. We prioritized those. Okay, routes to market. So there are many different ways, routes for an enterprise to source a private 5G solution. They can go through their existing SI partners. They could go straight, OEM could go straight to them. There could be a cloud provider in between. There could be a disruptive startup player like a Mavenir that goes straight to the enterprise that provides aspects of that full stack. So there's different models that we're seeing that are highly likely here. The things I want to convey here is the bullet points on the right. So there is going to be, in some of the large enterprises are not going to work with the CSP. They do not want to work with the CSP. So their model is probably going to be straight. They're going to probably procure straight from the OEM. They might use an SI partner to help them, like an Accenture, an IBM, someone like that. But they don't want SIM cards. They don't want to deal with telco processes and procedures. They don't want to deal with any of that. So they're going to look at other routes to market. Some do, though. Some will be okay with that, especially smaller companies that don't have the in-house resources. They are good candidates to go straight to the CSP, as well as potentially a cloud provider. That's another model that we think is going to take off. So I want to talk about Bosch and Mercedes to exemplify the different models. So Bosch is an example of an enterprise that believes they're going to do all this themselves. They're going to work directly with OEM, which they are, and they are going to procure the solution from the OEM, and then they're going to deal with it. Their CIO department is going to deal with it and implement it into their OT. Mercedes is a little bit different. Mercedes is working with Ericsson and Telefonica with those partners to implement 5G in some of their factories. So here, Mercedes is believing that they are going, they need partners to help them institutionalize some of these solutions, and they're looking for that resource augmentation as well. So I want to point those out because those are two very different models, routes to market that different large enterprises selected, and we're going to see that play out as enterprises move into how do they implement 5G as part of their broader digital transformations. We're going to see them start to pick some of these models that are listed on the left-hand side. Okay, spectrum, very important. There's three main routes to market for spectrum. Either the government issues licensed spectrum to the CSP, which then can provide services to the enterprise, or the government can provide private spectrum for enterprise usage, which is what we've seen in Germany in the 3.7 to 3.8 bands. And then there's unlicensed spectrum to enterprise where they can use things like Wi-Fi spectrum or CBRS or things like that. Or 60 gigahertz for enterprise users. Those are unlicensed bands that enterprises can consume. There's pros and cons to each, and we'll get to that in a second. There are reasons why some of these models make sense versus others, and let's get into that now. So what I've done here on this chart is I put the strengths and weaknesses of the different spectrum options. So you have public license, so that would be the CSP spectrum that they're providing to the enterprise. We have private license spectrum, which would be the Germany example. And then we have the unlicensed spectrum option, which is things like CBRS. So there's pros and cons to each, and there's no one option that makes the most sense. It really depends on the unique situation of the country, the situation of the enterprise and what they're trying to use it for, the cost points. It really depends on assessment of what that enterprise is trying to do, what's available to them, and then picking the best option based on that. So I'm not going to get into the weeds on the strengths and weaknesses here. What I really wanted to convey is there are no one model is superior to the other. There are pros and cons to each of these models. Okay, and then, so key takeaways, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So leading enterprises are ascertaining how 5G and other technologies are going to drive their digital transformations. This is happening. The ecosystem is preparing for this, even though commercially ready standalone variant of 5G is still at least a year away from an infrastructure and devices standpoint. So even if an enterprise gets their plans ready today to get that true variant that they're looking for, I'm not talking about NSA, I'm not talking about LTE advanced, I'm talking about 5G standalone. That architecture is not going to be ready for another year. That's really what the enterprises want, because that variant of the architecture provides the full range of benefits that and features that the enterprises are looking to utilize. Second point here, the key takeaway is governments are making it easier for enterprises to benefit from cellular technology. This is happening in certain countries like Germany, the States, Japan, China. These types of countries the governments are getting involved here. And making private license spectrum available, that's one way that they're driving this forward. The key reason why governments are, in some of these countries, are taking more of a role in this is because they believe and they're bought into the fact that 5G is going to be foundational for evolving their economies, bringing them into the digital era and keeping them competitive, as well as improving society, so improving people's quality of life. There's a case to be made for 5G doing that as well. Governments want to make sure that their countries have that technology implemented and that they're able to benefit from what that technology can provide. Enterprises across many industries intend to leverage 5G to transform their operations. This is really about operations transformation. This is net new. This is an area where 5G is going to be used in a way that it really hasn't been, that cellular hasn't been used before in enterprise environments. And this is really the net new opportunity, the big opportunity for the ecosystem is operations transformation. Yes, communications evolution is also important, but it's really the way machines get evolved in this revolution is really what's going to drive most of the economic growth here. And then last but not least, enterprises have multiple routes to source 5G solutions from the ecosystem. CSPs, though there is cases to be made where it makes sense to use a CSP, the first wave, I would say, of enterprises that are looking to do private 5G networks, there's an emphasis on them doing it themselves. That is probably going to level out over time, where we'll see network slicing become more mature, and we'll see smaller companies start to consume 5G in that way. But so essentially, there's multiple routes to market, and there's going to be some real competition for the CSPs, not only between CSPs, but also between CSPs and other players like the vendors, like the cloud providers, disruptive companies. They're all going to be competing against telcos for some of this opportunity, as well as working with them. So I would look at it as co-opetition, is how I describe it. Okay, so that's the material we wanted to share. We've got 10 minutes for questions. So what I'm going to do is go down the list. There's many questions. Just give me 1 second. All right. Question 1, how do you define private 5G? On-site RAN with licensed spectrum with integrations to customer network infrastructure, cloud, MEC. So it's any instance where an enterprise is procuring the 5G infrastructure. So you have to, as part of that solution, you have to have 5G NR. So there has to be, in order for us in our market sizing, there would have to be a sale of 5G NR by the enterprise as part of a broader solution that they're looking to do things like MEC, for example. Okay, next question is, do you see a slowdown or delay in private LTE since enterprises are waiting for SA 5G in 2021, or may they implement private LTE still as a bridge to an upgrade to 5G later? So great question. So yes, some enterprises I would say are waiting. Some are. I would say there's another tranche of enterprises that are looking at this from a stepping stone process. So some vendors, 5G solutions are software upgradable from LTE to 5G, and the core, the EPC that they're using, is also upgradable to a 5G architecture. For the most part, I'm talking big picture, right? But that model, that migration model is something that some enterprises have bought into and that they're planning to implement. So they are still going forward with private LTE, but as they're doing their system, the solution that they're procuring, they have an eye towards upgrading that to 5G at some point in the future. Okay, next question is, are enterprises doing the business case for understanding the ROI for implementing private networks? The investment could be as high as $500 million for large enterprises. So yes, some enterprises are doing that. And actually, they're having some of their partners help them with those calculations. So it is going to be big numbers. You mentioned $500 million for large enterprises. I don't disagree with a number that large. I would argue that the money might be less of an issue if there is a security sensitive aspect so looking at the reasons why the enterprise is deciding to do private 5G. In some cases, the cost might be a secondary or tertiary concern, and some other concern might be the ultimate decider. in those situations, the enterprise will spend the money. The money will materialize. And the reason that money will materialize is if they're getting a business outcome, so you mentioned ROI, if there's a definable business outcome from implementing the 5G solution, that might, that will help them to buy into that storyline. Also think of 5G as a platform. So, for example, if you implement a 5G solution inside of a factory, you wire up that entire factory with backhaul, and you have 5G NR, and you have a local core. You can run, conceivably, all kinds of types of workloads on that. And you could support all kinds of use cases. You could support the assembly line. You could support robots in the inventory management sector of the factory, where they're bringing input products, input ingredients into the assembly line, managing inventory flow. There's all different ways that 5G platform can be leveraged. So the ROI could be much broader than tying it to a very specific use case. Enterprises in certain verticals, like manufacturers, need to think about 5G as a platform that they buy, and that is foundational for them to migrate their operations technology and to bring those workloads into that platform. So that can dramatically change the equation for ROI and make it feasible to spend big money on a 5G solution. Next question is, can you provide an example of public licensed versus private licensed? So, yeah, so public licensed would be a CSP is providing maybe 5G communications use case. So they're providing smartphone coverage for from the public network to a campus location for an enterprise, using a spectrum band that is utilized for their public network. So say 700 megahertz in the States, right? So it's more on the communication side. The private licensed would be implicating network slicing. So where you're partitioning and dedicating a tranche of network resources to a very specific use case. So it's more network sliced focused in how I'm thinking about private licensed versus public licensed, where it's more of the communications technology for like smartphones, tablets, those types of things that are provided over the more public network. Okay, so next question is, yeah, so some companies are saying, why aren't they listed on the landscape slide? So again, there is many companies that did not make it on that list that are big key players in the market. I only listed some for talking points. We're going to have a more comprehensive list in our private cellular networks market landscape report. So there you'll see some of the companies, the ones that people sent questions about. I'm not going to name the companies, but your company is going to be listed in that report. Okay, the next question is, operators serve enterprises for mobility, fiber, SD-WAN, and many solutions. With such close relationship, I would guess that operators have a high chance of adding private LTE 5G to their enterprise portfolio than vendors or SIs. Thoughts? So yes and no. It depends on what the solution is being utilized for. So if you're using it for communications use cases, then yes, I would agree with you. When you start to use 5G in operations transformation, that is a situation where I believe that the enterprises will look to other providers for help there, and they're going to have much less reliance on the telco. So specifically what I'm talking about is things like smart factory, where you're using 5G as a platform and it's the lifeblood of your company. If your production goes down, that is a huge problem for the company. The CIO departments of those enterprises are probably going to want to have as much control over that 5G infrastructure as they possibly can, and that is going to de-emphasize the telco role in those types of environments. So it really depends on the use cases and the situations. But yeah, I agree. For certain use cases, I think the operators, it makes logical sense to use them for 5G. Okay, next question. What are some of the triggers for these industries to move to private 5G networks? Why can't they use 5G networks as telecom providers? So I think we covered that in some other questions. Next question. After a decade, LTE is still an order of magnitude more expensive to implement in a device than Wi-Fi. Is there anything about 5G which changes that equation? So materially, no. And thank you for bringing up the cost points. So it is more expensive to do the cellular than Wi-Fi. And you said orders of magnitude. It depends. It might not be that big, but it's bigger. My response to that would be, if you're looking to put mission critical, highly sensitive workloads into a network environment, that's okay if it costs more. Because if you don't do it right the first time and set up the system to meet the KPIs that you have, such as uptime, for example, it's worth the extra cost. And I think that some enterprises, as they do those ROI equations, if they start to look at their options here, they're starting to really factor in things beyond just cost. And that's where it gets real interesting. So I would agree with you that LTE, Wi-Fi, I think for the most part was still superior to LTE for the use cases it was being utilized for. 5G, I would say, is different because it's going to be utilized for use cases that are much more sensitive and have much lower tolerances for failure. And you're going to need the capabilities that 5G brings to the table, and you're going to have to spend more money to access that. Okay, next question. Even with, and by the way, I can go over time if people want to stay on. I think there's like 15 questions left in the queue, so I'll keep going for another 5 minutes or so if people want to stay on. The next question is, even with 5G, NFV, and network slicing, why do you think there is such a huge need to host private networks? Why can't CSPs do this effectively? Hosting private networks. So I think we talked about this in terms of the security aspect, the understanding of the pain points of the enterprise, the cultural mindset of some of the enterprises. Even though it might make sense for the CSP to do some of this, the enterprise, it might not matter to the enterprise. It really depends on their cultural mindset and the considerations that they have when they're deciding how they want to consume 5G network resources. So the next question is, are you considering venues like stadiums, airports, concert halls as enterprises or consumer? Those are enterprises. So for stadiums, for example, the NFL owners, the owners of those stadiums would be an enterprise, according to our definition. Even though consumers are coming into that location, if the stadium owner is procuring a 5G solution, then that would be a private 5G network. Next question is, when do you think the upcoming report will be available? That report will publish end of April this year. Next question is, do you have an update on what Rakuten is doing as a CSP? We do. That's going to be for another webinar we're going to be doing in a few months about web scales and what they're doing in the space. That's more on the consumer side, so I'm going to table that until that webinar. Next question is, wondering about CSP 5G offerings as a % of typical deployment. Example, if an SI is doing this, then would the connectivity only go to the CSP? The answer to that is, for the most part, yes. In those situations, the CSP would be relegated to the pipe. The value-added services would accrue to the SI. In most cases. In some cases, the CSP, if they have capabilities, and the person asking this question, your company has some of these capabilities, they might be able to accrue some of that stuff that might go to the SI. They might be able to do it themselves, but most telcos do not have, are not in the position of the person asking that question. So the SIs do have a key role to play in that value chain. Next question is, would in-building coverage venues be able to upgrade to private LTE? I think some of them are, and I think 5G is coming. I think Verizon is doing quite a bit with stadiums, as an example, in NFL stadiums in particular, innovation on the edge computing side. So yeah, I think that is happening. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Football stadiums globally, so soccer for you in States, those can be equipped with these types of solutions for AR, VR, differentiated experiences. That stuff's coming. Next question is, when it comes to spectrum for enterprises, is there a link between the property and license for the respective area? I'm not sure what you mean by that question. If you could maybe give me some more color there, I can tackle that. The next question is, what do you think about the potential for 5G adoption in hospitality industries, hotels, restaurants, resorts, given the less wide area focus of their businesses? So I think there is a play there. I don't believe that industry is going to be one of the early big scale adopters. I think that it's going to be more the industries that we listed out in that slide are going to drive the first wave or two of this implementation. But yes, I think, and there are use cases where that would make sense for hospitality. But I think we're going to see the actual commercial adoption of it, the implementation of it in commercial live environments is going to happen in other industries at larger scale first. Next question is, will the term private LTE be obsolete and replaced by private cellular / 5G? So it could be. And the reason it could be is because in some cases, depending on whose vendor solution you're using, that environment could be upgradable to 5G. Also, we talked before about 5G being the great converger of access mediums. So the lines could blur there, where you could actually have LTE traffic running on a slice on a 5G core, supporting certain types of workloads or IoT devices. That's definitely going to happen. And it makes sense why that would happen for chipsets, devices already out in the field that need to be supported. But I think that the convergence platform is going to be 5G. So I think we should call it 5G instead of just making a blanket statement of private cellular. I think 5G is going to be the great converger of all those cellular technologies ultimately. Next question is, you mentioned LTE is not suitable for mission critical workloads. What about the fact that most MC apps such as MCPTT are currently on LTE, especially for industries such as utilities? So I think you're talking about push to talk. So that's public safety, communications, person-to-person network. Yeah, I mean, LTE can be used for that. What I'm talking about is the new stuff, drone connectivity, surveillance technology, real-time, low-latency thermal imaging of a burning building for firefighter usage. That is stuff that LTE is not going to be used for. It's just not good enough to do it. 5G is what's going to be used there. Next question is, you don't see healthcare as a leading vertical. So we mentioned healthcare. I said telemedicine. The 6 verticals I listed are the 6 most impactful ones that we see today. That list I gave is not comprehensive. That is the list of verticals that we believe are going to spend the most on private 5G for the first wave or two of investment. Healthcare will ultimately be a massive consumer of 5G. There are some regulatory issues and hurdles that need to be cleared there before we see widespread adoption of it. But for things like telemedicine, yeah, I think that, especially given current world circumstances, I think there's a strong case to be made for using 5G in the healthcare domain. The next question is, can you repeat which go-to-market model is Bosch? So Bosch is procuring straight from the vendor, from the OEM. They're working directly with an OEM to source the 3GPP compatible 5G infrastructure that they're going to implement in their environments. Okay, and then one last question here is coming back to the one I postponed before. Clarification on that. They're asking about geographic area of private spectrum licenses. Yeah. So we talked about Germany and what they're doing there with 3.7 to 3.8. We do see instances of that in other countries. So Japan, China, the States. There's a couple of other countries in Europe that are also talking about this, where they're making private spectrum available direct to the enterprise, completely circumventing the CSP. Not all countries will do that. But if you notice, the countries that are doing that, the verticals that are requesting this and putting a lot of pressure on regulators to do this, I think is telling of where you're seeing most of that movement. So in Germany, the Germany is a manufacturing powerhouse. As a contribution to GDP, manufacturing is upwards of 20% of their gross domestic product. That's the highest, I believe, of any country in the world. So they have, for the most part, a lot of the larger enterprises there have a cultural mindset of they're going to do this themselves. They're going to own, operate, procure it, the 5G network themselves. And Bosch was an example of that. So that's where you see some of these private spectrum becoming available, because they're requesting it, and some of the country's governments are buying into the fact that, hey, maybe we should provide this. This might stimulate economic development and spur innovation in our country. Okay, so with that, I think I answered all the questions, and Sarah, I think we can end the call.
All right, everyone, please feel free to reach out to Chris with any more follow-up questions. If you have a few moments, it would be appreciated if you could fill out the survey on your screen. A replay version of the webcast will be available after the event and will be sent out to you via email. To view a list of our upcoming and past webinars, please visit tbri.com. Be sure to join us on Wednesday, May 6th for IoT Use Case Stories, How Use Cases Drive IoT. Thank you and have a great day.